Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Midwestern Marks live stream. I'm here with my brother from another mother, Carlos Garrido. We're going to be talking about a lot of interesting stuff today, having to do with geopolitics and whatnot. We'll be talking about Honduras a little bit and some of the accusations made against Democratic Socialist leader Xiomara Castro. We'll be talking about Gabon, which was the most recent African country to have their Western neocolonial puppet leaders overthrown in a coup. Cover that and talk about what's been going on in Africa in general. We'll touch on the American Airline strike authorization that just passed as their workers are potentially gearing up for a strike here. And we might talk about the NFL running backs demanding that the league and the franchises owned by extremely wealthy owners pay them more. So should be an interesting show today. Got a diverse array of topics to talk about. We'll get right into it after the intro. All right. How's it going, Carlos? I'm not going to lie. I'm a little tired. I had not one but two wrestling practices today, and I was doing pretty well against the medium-sized guys. So they put me with the big guys. I had to wrestle these giant meatheads. So I'm a little tired from that, but I'm pumped to do a stream here tonight.
Yeah, no, I am too, man. And I very much enjoyed your article on wrestling and the purity fetish that we just published, I believe yesterday, right? Um, and yeah, I could after reading that, I can see how you would apply the sort of overcoming of the purity fetish and wrestling the bigger guys and not expecting to land the moves perfectly, but be able to always adapt to the circumstance and be flexible and not reduce reality to any idea or run away from reality because you couldn't uh, um, effectively do the move in the perfect form that it existed in your head. It's a very interesting article. We don't do a lot of stuff on sports. We hope to do a little bit more on sports from now on, since it's such a central part of so many working people's lives. But um, yeah, I've found it a very enjoyable and enlightening article, and it's great to see the theory of the purity fetish applied in different fields. And I recommend everyone to read it, even if wrestling is not your thing. There's a lot to learn, and I'm sure if you're uh, an athlete in another sport, you'll find that there's some areas of resonance here.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was interesting. I was sharing it with a lot of my wrestling friends, and they thought it was interesting as well. My brother said he wishes he had that when he started his career because it helped him understand the sport better. So it's cool. And as I was writing it helped me understand the purity fetish concept better. Like, I mean, and we've always known this, but it became really clear to me that what the purity fetish is really a critique of undialectical thinking. You know, um, that's and for a while I've been thinking about applying dialectical thinking to the sport of wrestling. So this article was actually pretty easy to whip up because I've been applying it to wrestling for my own methods, or for my own purposes to change how I think about the sport and try and improve how I'm competing in the sport. So yeah, I was happy to write that article, and it's always really cool for me when I can get a little bit of crossover between what I do for Midwestern Marks and what I do with wrestling. So
Yeah, I think you said it best there. The absence of dialectical thinking, and that's how I've referred to it. Both in the book and in the many interviews and stuff I've done around the book, which is that it's really a concept that helps us formulate in a positive form that absence of dialectical thinking. And we've had similar concepts like that in the past, and often we've used in the Marxist tradition the term metaphysics to describe the absence of dialectics and to separate two types of thinking. This is something that Mao does in the beginning of On Contradiction. There's two schools of thought. There's dialectics and metaphysics, and I'm not a fan by any stretch of the imagination of that division, because you get into muddy waters where you have figures which are very clearly within the tradition of metaphysics, like Aristotle, Plato, Descartes, which are then treated by Marx and Engels as dialecticians. And then you have figures which are dialecticians, but because certain parts of their project sustain a metaphysical outlook, which are called metaphysicians. People like Kant. In many ways, Kant is working within a tradition of critiquing metaphysics and resituating it in a way that's torn away from the dogmatisms of scholastic Wolffian metaphysics. So that term wasn't the best, and I've always looked for an alternative. I don't know if the purity fetish fully fits that description, since it's describing something else, but the essence of it is that absence of dialectical thought.
well, I can't believe you would critique Mao, because Jordan Peterson told me that all Marxists are dogmatists who worship their leaders. So that's very anti-Marxist of you to criticize Mao.
But even just the word metaphysics is just that which is beyond the physical, and that doesn't have to be something transcendent or supernatural. It could be something that's a suprasensible thing. Things like relations. You can't specifically point at a relationship, but it has a certain objectivity. And how does Marx? What does Marx call the commodity? This little mystical thing for political economies. It's a sensible thing. It's got on the one side objectivity, but it's also as commodity, not as a use object, but as commodity. It doesn't have tangibility, but it's still an objective phenomenon. So like the term metaphysics refers to whatever is just metaphysics, beyond the physical. And when we're constructing these comprehensive outlooks such as dialectical materialism and positing certain fundamental ontological, formulated in a dialectical manner, but ontological laws of a being that's always thought as becoming, we're doing metaphysics. We're not just dealing with a very shallow empiricism. We're going beyond that, beyond the simply physical. So that term and that juxtaposition of metaphysics and dialectics is a little weird. And Hegel felt that you can't have human thinking without metaphysics. Like human thinking is always already in some form metaphysical, and I definitely consider myself to see the term metaphysics in that tradition as well.
For sure. So along those same lines, in this song, Say Hey, I Love You by Michael Franti, he says, now I'm not a highly metaphysical man. So what the hell does that mean? He just throws it out there. He's like, no, I'm not a highly metaphysical man.
He's very clearly working within the tradition of the British analytic philosophy against the dominance of Hegel in the continental world. That's another distinction that I think it's correct. Philosophy likes, perhaps for the sake of simplifying things in teaching, that likes to put things into nicely boxed traditions. And often that is incorrect. There's a lot of people that are working, I think, within the purity fetish that in other areas of their analysis are extremely dialectical, right? I describe Plato, the way that shows up in Plato, the way it shows up in Aristotle, but in each instance, I show, in other parts of their work, how dialectics could be seen. It's not either fully one or fully the other, but for the sake of convenience, sometimes we're forced to classify things in these ways. And like if you're teaching, I just finished yesterday's class of our Marxism and the History of Western Philosophy course, which we're teaching for the Institute's Marxism School. We just covered David Hume and Rene Descartes, and I had to explain that distinction that's made in any elementary course on modern philosophy between the rationalists and the empiricists, and why it's a distinction that, although it might be in some ways helpful, it could lead to a certain form of simplification of thinkers and a blending of thinkers within one tradition that in reality have quite a few things different from each other, and then an artificial separation of thinkers just because they're a part of another tradition. In many ways, both the empiricists and the rationalists are all turning back to Descartes, and in some ways basing their projects on a reading through and a critique of Descartes, and that's not captured by these nice little categories of just empiricists and rationalists. It's not to say that there isn't commonality that warrants that classification in some ways, but we should always be cognizant of perhaps some of the complexities and contradictions at play.
I couldn't agree more. I think I haven't read Descartes ever, so but I bet I'll take your word for it. The first story that we wanted to talk about today, let me pull it up, is, well, what do you want to jump into first, Gabon or Honduras?
I guess we could do Gabon. We have, I think, more comments on Gabon than anything else. So I see it as the primary story of the day, and I think it's the one that's making the biggest impact.
Definitely. So Gabon was the most recent country in Africa to have a coup against their what they're saying are French neocolonial leaders, but as we were looking into it, the U.S. is definitely one of the neocolonial powers that at least controls a lot of Gabon's economy. And one of the main things that the coup leaders and the people are demanding is that the French military bases get out. So they're really focusing on France right now, but obviously these are just Western multinationals that have been exploiting the country for a long time. And they have this leader, Ali Bongo, who's been in power, or whose family has been in power for 53 years. So nothing but a Western puppet dictatorship, and one that's been in power for, like, I believe Richard Medhurst said that'd be like 9 U.S. presidencies in a row. So, and oftentimes, I had this written in my notes too, oftentimes Africa kind of goes under the radar. Like when I was researching Niger, I read that whenever they had their last election, it was recently, there was a great deal of evidence that the U.S. just rigged the election. It looked like their guy was going to lose, so they, funneled a bunch of money into the country, and there were all these suspicious things that happened on voting day, and basically rigged the election against Niger. And, even in the quote unquote leftist or socialist media, you didn't hear much about that. So it's great to see Africa getting more attention. It's great to see all these neo-colonial uprisings, because we know as Marxists, or just people who are rational and follow geopolitics, colonialism never ended. If you read a history book right now, it'll say, colonialism ended after World War II, because all these countries were given what we call flag independence. They said you are no longer a direct political colony of Western country A, but Western countries still control the economies of these countries, and they use that control to prop up puppet dictatorships that give them whatever they want. So if you control the economic base of a country, if you control their the surplus of that country, and the the value that's created by the labor of that country, you control that country. If you control production, you pretty much control everything. So that's what's going on with Gabon. This was an article from the Gray Zone.
Can I just say something real quick?
Yeah, sorry. I didn't mean to get ahead of you.
The 53 years thing, because this is something specifically that the imperialists are always bringing out. They talk about the Castro dictatorship. You've been in power 5 decades or 6 decades or whatever it is, as if just being in power a very long time automatically constitutes a dictatorship, or as if democracy can be simply reduced to a constant change in which face is going to be the puppet that ends up, being the face of all the governmental decisions. And that's incorrect. There's genuinely the possibility that a leadership could remain the same for 50 and 60 years and not be a dictatorship. And the question that we must ask is, well, is it genuinely representing the will of the people? That's all democracy is. If you break it down, demos kratos, demos, the popular folk, common people, and kratos means power. Is this leadership genuinely a reflection of the will of the vast majority of the people, of the general will of the people? And so it doesn't matter how long they're in power. What matters is, are they capable of doing that? And you have, cases such as Cuba, where that was the case. You have cases such as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Free Korea, where that's also the case. Richard Medhurst, he brings it up in his segment, how the same thing happened with Assad and his father, where they brought stability to a region that was completely unstable thanks to neocolonialism and decades of colonialism and imperialism. And it was a government and a series of governments that were very much supported by their people. So that's not the same as, the Bongo family, which has been from the start the puppet of French and American imperialists, and there has been a government, like all neocolonial governments, who only has to answer to one interest group, and it's not the people of Gabon. It is, the interest of U.S. and U.S. specifically, but French and imperialism in general. The interests of multinationals that he answers to. It's not the people of Gabon, and you see it recurring. It's not just one random thing that has happened. We've had 8 of these in the last 8 years. 8 years. We've had 2 in the last month. We just spoke about the coup in Niger not too long ago. Now we have another one in Gabon, and it's telling of the age and of the general crisis in the imperialist system, and the imperialist system in its stage of neocolonialism, which, as you mentioned, one of the central things that distinguishes it from before is that sort of flag sovereignty, where it's sovereign only in name, but in substance, their political economy and therefore their politics is fully controlled, usually by the same country which used to be the old metropole.
Absolutely. I think that's a really interesting point, the one you brought up about political dynasties. Like the Western liberal bourgeois media only critiques political dynasties if it's Assad, if it's the Kim family, even though, the Kim family is obviously there's a cult of personality there. And you would expect that after Kim Il-sung led his people in the War of Liberation against the Japanese colonizers, and then defended against the invading U.S. imperialists. But those leaders are elected, as is Assad, rightfully elected by their people, by a large majority of their people, actually. But those political dynasties aren't okay. The only political dynasties that are okay are the Clinton family or the Bush family or whatever puppet dictatorship that the U.S. is trying to prop up in Gabon. And something interesting about this article is Ali Bongo is actually really useful to the U.S. in their war on Libya, in that horrendous war that saw Gaddafi overthrown, where the U.S. and Hillary Clinton and NATO, who were leading this up, had no exit plan whatsoever. So they topple the country's government while backing a bunch of terrorist extremist groups and just dip. So now, warlords have been fighting in the power vacuum that's created. And that's also why these sort of anti-imperialist coups are such a big deal geopolitically, right? The Western powers are losing the footholds that they previously had in Africa. We now had one in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and now Gabon, which Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are all in West Africa. Gabon, not so much, but still under the same sort of system of French neocolonialism. So there's this anti-imperialist, anti-colonial sentiment and real movement spreading across Africa. And, there was, a huge anti-colonial movement across the global South at the end of World War II. But this is sort of like a resurgence of that, a resurgence against neocolonialism. Like, we recognize that we have flag independence, but these countries are still super exploiting us for our resources. And they still have military bases all over. And eventually AFRICOM is going to be something they have to tackle too, the U.S. Africa Command, which allows them to maintain a constant shadow drone war across pretty much the entire continent of Africa. That kills a large number of civilians every year. That was greatly expanded by this man, Obama, by the way.
Yeah, and in many cases, it's you had the countries that were successful in that post-war period of decolonization, of entering the stage of what the imperialists call post-colonialism, or what we would call neocolonialism, a more insidious form of imperialism and colonialism. But you had the struggles that won and sustained power, and some of those countries are still around. And you had those that didn't. And a lot of the uprisings that we're seeing today are in countries that have, that weren't able to obtain their sovereignty. That went with that flag sovereignty that you're talking about. And but you also have countries that won for a period of time and then had their governments toppled. And you see that, I think, very clearly. The archetypical case is Burkina Faso and the coup and murder of Thomas Sankara, and then the sort of reincarnation that you have now with this series of what they're calling colonel coups, which are led by people in their 20s and 30s, sometimes trained even by the U.S., but turning against a system that they have been able to see has devastated their parents, their grandparents, and is devastating their generations and providing no real future for their people. And Ibrahim Traoré, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, I'm sure I'm not, but he's almost like this resurgence of the spirit of Sankara in Burkina Faso. And it's beautiful to see. So it's hopefully that power can be sustained. A lot of these colonel coups, neocolonial anti-neocolonial coups, they're not ideologically pure. That's one of the questions that I think people usually bring up, like these socialist governments that are going to be brought forth. I don't know. It seems that a lot of them are driven by a deep patriotism, a deep love of their country, of their nation, and a desire to have their country, their resources, and their people not be looted. Not continue to be looted by French and American and other multinational corporations that are stealing their wealth, making their countries dependent on these imperialist countries, and immiserating their people. So insofar as they have that deep patriotic or nationalistic sentiment, you're going to have a similar effect to what you had with Fidel Castro, where that progressive nationalism eventually has to realize, if it stays there, that the only way out is socialism. The only way out is having the control over the land, the industries, the key industries of the country be in the hands of its working people, the vast majority of its people, and making those serve those people themselves who would be running and operating and controlling those centers of production.
Very well said. And similar to Niger, this was a coup that was led by the security forces, who are actually supposed to protect the president. And, you know, some people might say that proves that it's an undemocratic coup or whatever. But similar to the coup in Niger, the people immediately hit the streets to show their support for the coup government and to demand that the French and other Western neocolonial powers leave the country. So here's a video of hundreds of people singing in the streets and celebrating the overthrow of what everyone in the country recognizes are French puppet dictators.
Coup de la démocratie.
Come on now.
If you want to send it to me, I could pull it up.
I guess I got to start downloading these videos before we play them. A Rothschild-funded mining company has suspended operations in Gabon as well. All right, I'm going to send it over to Carlos. I don't know what's up with my Wi-Fi today. But yeah, mass support for this. The parallel I always draw is Venezuela, although the military coup there was unsuccessful. And then Hugo Chavez, 8 years after the attempted military coup, was elected. But it's a progressive coup led by the military because it has the mass support from the people.
Absolutely, and there's quite a few of those in the history of the 20th century. You have, of course, Juan Velasco in Peru. We also have many others, and we have a project we're collaborating with the folks from the Hampton Institute with precisely this topic. But here it is: the people of Gabon hitting the streets against the puppet government of Bongo.
Coup de la démocratie.
So massive support from the people in the streets demanding that the French and the U.S. get out. And this is, I don't know if this has been confirmed yet. I saw this on Twitter and then saw this article about it. Apparently, the Bongo family, the former Western-backed dictators of the country, were seen leaving the money with bags and bags of cash given to them by Western powers. So, I mean, if it couldn't get, or if it could get any more obvious that they were a Western puppet leadership or whatever you want to call it, they had suitcases and suitcases of Western cash. So this is how the West gets these compradors to do this. This is how they got Blaise Compaoré to kill Thomas Sankara on Burkina Faso. It's literally just preying on people's selfishness, you know, via opportunism, saying that if you give us what we want in your country, we'll make sure that you don't get cooed, we'll protect you, and then we'll give you bags and bags of cash so you and your family can live in luxury, while the rest of the country gets exploited and is prevented from developing their productive forces. So pretty wild to see this.
That's another one of the central distinctions between neocolonialism and colonialism. Colonialism, all of the people from the colonized country were basically fucked. It was a very small, perhaps you can have an intelligentsia that could have been educated in the metropole, but you know, it was very difficult to even develop like a bourgeoisie and a national political class. A lot of the times, full control was in the metropole. In neocolonialism, there is a class that begins to benefit from neocolonialism, and it's these folks that Jose Marti would call gusanos de corbata, worms with bow ties. That's where we get the sort of slur against the treasonous Cubans from Miami. We call them gusanos. It comes from Jose Marti. These are people that are selling out their nations for a few bucks. But we had, by the way, that sort of running out with the bags. It reminds me of the Cuban Revolution when the bourgeoisie and the corrupt political class left. They left with the people's reserves. So they took gold. They took a lot of the some of the central reserves of the Cuban economy, and it explained in part why they were able to so easily enrich themselves once they got to South Florida. But we have a really good question here from Stalin's Mustache, which is wonderful. Terrific name. I think that's the old name of Roland blog, by the way. But how do you think the U.S. will react to this? Well, I'm not sure, but I'm sure that it's going to have some retaliation depending on what the new government in Gabon decides to do with their primary industry, which is oil. So if we look here at the World Atlas, it says that the country has the 6th largest proven deposits of oil on the continent, having an estimated 3.68 billion barrels of oil reserves. The country has tapped into its immense oil deposits and has a daily production of oil estimated at 0.244 million barrels. Gabon only consumes a tiny fraction of its oil production. The country's daily consumption is 0.013 million barrels, with the bulk of the oil produced being sold to foreign markets. Oil is the largest export item from the country and is also the country's chief foreign exchange earner. Crude oil accounts for about 96% of the country's total exports to the U.S. Some of the crude oil is refined at the country's sole refinery, the Segura Oil Refinery, which is partly owned by the Gabonese government. The country also has enormous deposits of natural gas, the U.S. is clearly one of the central factors in keeping Gabon dependent. And remember that dependency functions in a dual form, usually. One, there's the dependence that is laid in the economies of these countries through the fact that neocolonialism and colonialism before that forced them to only produce whatever low-tech commodity was needed for imperialism. So, for instance, in Cuba, you have sugar primarily, but you also have tobacco. In Gabon, you have oil, right? But you also have some minerals. You have the mineral manganese, which is central for steel production, for metals, and it's one of the most mineral-rich places in Africa. But you have one form of dependency, which is we're going to force your country to produce that natural resource, which we can exploit the best. So focus on what we can exploit the best super exploit really the best from your country, whatever resources we can extract the best and super exploit the labor of. So that's a form of dependency, right? And what's interesting here is that if you look at the World Atlas, how they comment on it specifically, the dangers of oil reliance. What's never mentioned is what is the system that forces these countries into oil reliance. They spin the same narrative about Venezuela. They spin it for a while about Cuba. It's sugar reliance and sugar dependency, because of course, an effect of this economic dependency on one specific commodity or a couple of different commodities is that your whole economy is subject to global fluctuations in the market of the price of that commodity. So when, for instance, in Cuba, when sugar was doing good, the elite in Cuba could be doing good. And when it was doing bad, the opposite. So that's one form of dependency. And another one is, who is this being shipped towards usually? And it's almost always the case that the metropole, the central neocolonial power engaged in that relationship with the country, establishes a second form of dependency, which is not just on the thing that's being produced primarily, the monocrop, but on trading that and selling that, exporting that to the metropole. In the case of Cuba, it was selling sugar to the U.S. In the case of Gabon, it's selling oil, exporting oil to the U.S., which is 96% of its export sales of oil are going to the U.S.
Absolutely. I always say that what made me a Marxist was I studied geopolitics and economics in college for 4 years. And then reading Lenin's Imperialism, a 110-page book from 1917, I was able to understand the world and understand geopolitical happenings better than anything I had been taught. Whoops, sorry. Better. It helped me understand things better than anything I had been taught in 4 years of studying politics at the university level. And one of the chapters that was the most enlightening for me was chapter 4 on export capital, which, if you haven't read Lenin's Imperialism or at least watched our reading guide of it, please do. It's such a vital and important text. But basically, he says that countries are going to outsource capital, but only the capital that they need to extract resources from the target country. So in Venezuela, like, they have these giant oil reserves. The U.S. And British and Western oil companies set up drills to suck out the oil, but the surplus value is being transported back to the West. It's being sucked out of the country. So there's no investment in their productive forces or, diversified kinds of fixed capital. And the entire economy becomes dependent on whatever commodity is being exported. So I often tell the story of my right-wing GOP economics professor who said that Venezuela's economy was dependent on oil because of socialism. And when I pressed her on it, she had no explanation beyond that. And then I read Lenin's Imperialism, and it's like, oh, it's the export capital. That makes perfect sense. So the bourgeois mode of analyzing the world has no explanation for this. They just say it's corruption, it's socialism, it's their fault for being economically stupid and backwards, that they're dependent on these resources, when in reality it's because of the export capital and because of the super exploitation of these countries that they can't invest in developing their own productive forces. So hopefully these countries now are able to establish stable political leaderships, and, as Carlos said, eventually realize that what they need to do is take hold of production. They need to move towards socialism, because if they allow market forces to work, and if they allow capitalism to continue, then the West will sink their claws back in and continue to exploit these countries and rob them for everything they're worth.
Yeah, and I mean, we have to go to Parenti, as is usual here at the Institute. None of these countries are poor. You don't go to a poor country to make money. They're extremely rich. They're extremely rich in resources and in people. What they are is super exploited. That is what explains their condition. They're super exploited, not inherently poor or inherently deficient or whatever other bullshit rationalization is provided in order to legitimize the continued expropriation and super exploitation of these countries. And part of the importance of theory, which is I think what sets the Institute apart, specifically in our coverage of geopolitics, which is that we don't just explain to you what's happening with this specific place. And there's a lot of people that do that, and some of them do it very well. They provide you a very comprehensive picture, and I think they're correct insofar as they do that. But when you have the theoretical tools, you're able to see the systematic character of all of these things, and you're able to connect the dots in ways that are much more enlightening than just analyzing the sort of compilation and conjunction of crude facts of what is going on. So if I may, real quick, I wanted to provide a few quotes from Kwame Nkrumah, of course, the revolutionary socialist Pan-African leader of Ghana, who was couped in a U.S. CIA led coup while he was gone in China, but who wrote a very fundamental text called Neocolonialism, the Highest Stage of Imperialism, which brings into play how it is that imperialism in the post-war period is functioning through neocolonialism. There's 4 specific quotes that I wanted to get at. The first one gets at what Eddie has been talking about as flag democracy. He's going to say the essence of neocolonialism is that the state which is subject to it is, in theory, independent and has the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from outside. From where outside? Obviously from the metropoles and the centers of the imperialist system that benefit from such a condition. Do you have anything to comment on that quote before I go to the next one, Eddie?
No, go for it.
So this is an interesting one for a few reasons, but he's going to say the result of neocolonialism is that foreign capital is used for the exploitation rather than for the development of the less developed parts of the world. Investment under neocolonialism increases rather than decreases the gap between the rich and the poor countries of the world. So this was already known by Lenin, obviously. But this is one of the central things, because people talk about how China is the leading export of capital, and they're like, oh my God, China's imperialist. The question is, what is China doing when it exports capital around the world? Is it impoverishing these nations? Is it exacerbating the divide between the so-called extreme wealth of China as a rich country and the poverty of these nations? It's doing the complete opposite. It's using that export of capital in the form that Nkrumah argued is a positive form, right? In the sense of it's capital that's being used to develop the productive forces of these countries, and in some way or another, it's giving them the conditions for the possibility of being more sovereign and self-sufficient. Any comments on that one before I go to the other one? That's the third one.
No, you can go for it.
Okay. Let me see here.
I'll give you a ding.
This is a good one, because this is another thing that the leftists fall for and has come into prominence in the era of woke imperialism, where a form of woke or pseudo-progressive ideology has come to be the dominant form of rationalizing imperialist conquest around the world. But Nkrumah is going to argue the system of neocolonialism was therefore instituted, and in the short run, it has served the development of powers admirably. If it is in the long run, my bad, I read the wrong quote. Neocolonialism is based, it was the quote right after. Neocolonialism is based on the principle of breaking up former large united colonial territories into a number of small, non-viable states which are incapable of independent development and must rely on the former imperial power for defense and for internal security. Their economic and financial systems are linked, as in the colonial days, with those of the former colonial ruler. So there's a few parts going on here. This is, in essence, the importance of Pan-Africanism. Like the West has obviously divided these territories, and that old dictum of divide and conquer is at play here. It's easier to conquer and to control and to dominate these places when they're divided and fractured. It's harder to do that when they come together and are a solid block that can become self-sufficient. It is also it creates the conditions for the waging of what Nkrumah calls a limited form of warfare. You're not waging these outright massive wars. You're waging, as we're seeing in the war against Russia, the proxy war against Russia, you're waging these proxy wars, these limited wars, where you don't have to get involved at large in these massive war efforts, but you have a bunch of limited wars that you're dealing with. Now, where I see the extreme relevance of this is in the discourse that comes out of some liberal or so-called progressive left communities about Russia and about China, which under the guise of decolonialization, what they're promoting is this form of balkanization and this form of separating territories, which has historically been central for this process of neocolonialism in this stage of imperialism, because it allows the dominant imperial powers to dominate these areas and to continue extracting their resources and super exploiting their people and controlling their politics and economies and finance. It allows them to do that much easier once you're separated because they're weaker. And this is what, unfortunately, some segments of the left desire seen in places like Russia and China, under, again, this guise of, progressive decolonialism, decolonize Russia, decolonize China. You're even getting U.S. State Department officials talking in those terms. But yeah, any comment on that one? I had one more, if you don't mind. No comment? Okay. So the last thing I wanted to touch on is the last quote from Nkrumah. He says, in the first place, the rulers of the neocolonial states derive their authority to govern not from the will of the people, but from the support which they obtain from their neocolonialist masters. They have therefore little interest in developing education, strengthening the bargaining power of their workers employed by the capitalist firms, or indeed of taking any step which would challenge the colonial pattern of commerce and industry, which is the object of neocolonialism to preserve. Why are the people in Gabon, why are the people in Niger, why were the people in Mali and Guinea and Burkina Faso, why are they standing up to these governments? Why are they overthrowing these governments via coups? Is it because it's a government that actually represents the people of those countries? No. It's because their governments are stooges for imperialism and neocolonialism. They're puppet governments of U.S. imperialism and French imperialism, whose interest when they rule is not in increasing the living standards of their people, expressing the general will of their people. Their interest is their personal enrichment, which is done through serving the masters whom they actually have to respond to, which is the U.S. and France and these multinational corporations in general.
For sure, that's a solid quote there. I like putting the theory to the geopolitical analysis because it makes it so much easier. I mean, that's the point I was getting at with Lenin's imperialism really helping me understand what I had learned, the factual accumulation of facts that I had gotten in 4 years of studying politics in undergrad. The theory just really helps you tie it all together. That's why theory is important. It helps you understand the world. So, yeah, and the Nkrumah is pretty great. So,
alrighty. So, do we want to switch now to talking about Honduras and Xiomara Castro and the recent rallies that have been going on against the attacks from the far right that are trying to prevent the democratic election of a new attorney general and deputy attorney general. I don't know if you want to pull that one up, and I've done a little bit of reading now with Nkrumah quotes, so maybe you can read this one and then we react to it as you go.
For sure. Yeah, this is a short article from People's Dispatch, which everybody should follow. Put it in your bookmarks. They publish constant good journalism about the places where there's political unrest and, constantly publishing about geopolitics from the perspective of the people. So it says Honduras mobilized in support of Xiomara Castro's government. The head of state called for the mobilization following an intensified destabilization campaign by the far right-wing opposition. Thousands of people took to the streets in the Honduran capital of Tegucigalpa.
Tegucigalpa. For some reason, the C is pronounced with the TH. That's what
Tegucigalpa. On the afternoon of Tuesday, August 29th, to express their support for the government of President Xiomara Castro. The head of state had called for the mobilization in response to the attempt by right-wing opposition deputies to impede the election of a new attorney general and deputy attorney general. Xiomara and others from the Liberty and Refoundation Party have warned that the moves by the National Party, which ruled for 12 years following the coup against Manuel Zelaya in 2009, and its allies from the Patriotic Alliance and Salvador Honduras parties are a part of a broader campaign of destabilization with the objective to carry out a coup against her.
If anyone wants to know, by the way, a little bit more about that history of how they coup Zelaya in 2009, because he comes into power not really being like a anti-imperialist leftist, or so. He was fairly moderate center, almost like center-right, and he has this radical shift in direction during his rule. He becomes objectively anti-imperialist and much more in favor of something like a democratic socialism or a social democracy, a radical third world social democracy. And he gets couped in 2009. And I believe the story goes somewhat like him getting kidnapped and taken on a helicopter to the middle of a jungle or something like that. I know this is something that we spoke with Ramiro when I think the first interview we ever did with him. He covered it quite thoroughly, how it was that the coup of Manuel Zelaya went on, and it turned a country that was prosperous, on its way developing. The crime rates were getting lower, and the government that's instituted, the coup government, it's basically it instituted for the last decade a narco state. Crime has risen. It had for many years the highest crime rates in all of Central America. It's been a drug pen. Even U.S. officials have admitted of how leaders and key figures of this U.S. propped up government have been involved in the drug trade and with the cartels and all that stuff. So Xiomara, of course, wins. I believe it was last year now, or 2 years ago now. But she's been in power for a little bit over a year, I think. And she's the wife of Manuel Zelaya, and the movement that she's carrying forth is ideologically quite broad, but she sees herself as a form of democratic socialist, social democrat. I just wanted to provide that background, just so that.
That's good. When addressing the Sea of Red on Tuesday afternoon, Xiomara declared, "We must remain united, organized, and mobilized in resistance so that in Honduras there will be no more coup d'etat, narco dictators, nor pillaging." While the threats by the National Party against Xiomara's government have been constant since she was sworn in, the ending of the term of the country's current Attorney General, Oscar Chinchilla, and the government's decision to elect a new one, has sparked the latest wave of tension. National Party deputies allege that the decision by Libre Party deputies to elect a new Attorney General to replace Chinchilla following the expiration of his mandate on August 31st is a violation and an attempt to impose a socialist dictatorship in Honduras. I was telling Carlos, this is why I don't even, why even call yourself a democratic socialist? They're going to call you authoritarian anyways, right? You could take the most democratic route to power ever, like Xiomara Castro has in Honduras, and they're gonna call you a dictator no matter what. Like, you could try and set up, just hire a new attorney general, and you can't even do that without getting called a dictator. But just shows how the playbook of the bourgeois media is played out at this point.
Right. I mean, everything she's doing is constitutional. So, like, her process of social transformation so far has occurred within the realms of this bourgeois state and these bourgeois institutions, and even that is not enough to satisfy them. And what you have to realize is that when it comes out of the mouths of the imperialists, words like dictator, democracy, they're meaningless. They're meaningless. What they mean is usually almost always the opposite of what it is that you think they mean when it comes out of their mouth. And again, why, if they're going to call you communist, Stalinist, whatever. Why not just go all the way? That's one of the. But again, we're not within these processes. We don't know the limits that they're working with in the process of radically transforming their countries. So, struggles start at different points, and not every struggle can do what Cuba did, which is just immediately kick the imperialists out. And even that one, it wasn't immediate. It was in part. There was a back and forth for a year or so before it was able to fully nationalize industries and kick the multinational corporations fully out.
Absolutely. Which part am I on here? Chinchilla served as Attorney General since 2013, was a crucial ally to the coup-installed National Party government. So why wouldn't they want to get this guy out? Look at how hard the Democrats are persecuting Donald Trump just because they say he incited the January 6th riots. But when other people in other countries are literally involved with a foreign coup, they're not allowed to do anything about it. Like when they attacked Bolivia for prosecuting the murderous fascist Janine Áñez, who murdered trade unionists and activists in order to take power in a CIA-backed coup.
And Nicaragua.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
For prosecuting people who are literal traitors and treasonous to the homeland and who participated in, these CIA orchestrated color revolution attempts in, I think it was 2019, 2018. If you want to learn more about that, by the way, check out Dan Kovalek, our comrade Dan Kovalek's book on Nicaragua.
Hell yeah. For many Hondurans, the election of the new attorney general is an essential piece of rebuilding the country and freeing it from the grip of far-right forces. Pedro Mejia, a lawyer from the Studies for Dignity law firm, told Criterion HN that while serving as attorney general, Chinchilla used the office to persecute environmental defenders and social fighters, and on the other hand, guaranteeing impunity for political and business elites who benefited from environmental permits and corrupt environmental concessions. So where was the bourgeois media when all this was going on, right? When far-right coup forces were jailing activists and, allowing business owners to pillage the country. Where was the bourgeois media to call them a dictatorship then, to call them authoritarian then? No, it's only when they try and prosecute the murderers and the terrorists backed by the CIA that they're authoritarian. Mejia added that Chinchilla's role was to ensure through criminalization, on the one hand, that there was no opposition to the imposition of extractive mining, hydroelectric, and forestry projects in the territory. So again, it all centers around production, right? It's all about the economic exploitation. The politics is just and the U.S.'s foreign policy is just a way to ensure that their economic exploitation can continue.
It sounds a little bit similar to a story I think we might have just covered, and to a few quotes of theorizing on the system that produces results like this. And this is, again, the importance of theory, because it provides a sort of generalized, concrete awareness of how these systems operate. And then you're able to, on the basis of that, see how that takes particular forms, how that universal system takes particular forms in different cases. In the case of Cuba, in the case of Honduras, in the case of Gabon, whatever it might be. But you see the similarities there.
For sure. Carlos Zelaya, the secretary of the National Congress and a member of the Libre Party, said in a press conference, the National Party is afraid to elect a prosecutor who can set important precedents against corruption. He added that the country suffered from 12 years of corruption and impunity. Even the United States has accused the former National Party president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, of drug trafficking, while here he has gotten off scot-free. Amid the rising tensions and destabilization moves, a member of U.S. Congress, Maria Elvira Salazar, who leads anti-left and anti-Cuban legislation, wrote, "She was
the one that did the call to condemn socialism that we covered earlier this year."
Oh, she sounds like a real gem. This is like the world's biggest Karen is how I picture her. Ziamora in Honduras looks more and more like her husband, Zelaya, who passionately embraced Castro Chavismo. That's my new ideology. Castro Chavismo. Midwestern marks
Yeah,
are
baby.
Castro Chavismoists. I fucking love it. Just as Castro created the CDRs in Cuba
That's the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution, by the way, for the people.
and Chavez, the colectivos in Venezuela, now Madam President organizes teams to silence and arrest opponents. Bad road. Honduras's National Congress began deliberations at the evening of August 9th to elect a new Attorney General, and Deputy Attorney General are set to finalize before August 31st. So this is what I always talk about with authoritarianism as a response to imperialism. Right, the CIA and the Western imperialist powers are trying to destabilize these countries, so they set up committees to defend the revolution, or collectivos, or teams, which are basically forms of protecting the revolution, protecting democracy, protecting the people. And from a Leninist perspective, when you have a socialist revolution, you have to smash the existing state and create a new state with new armed bodies of the state, with new people's militias. So an actually democratic form of the state. But when countries do this, they're accused of being authoritarian by the country who's trying to destabilize them, by the country who's trying to oust a democratically elected leader, because they have institutions that are set up to protect democracy and protect the will of the people. The bourgeois media responds by calling it authoritarian, but they wouldn't even need to do this if it wasn't for the regime change efforts of the West.
And if they're doing this now, and we can confirm that they're doing it now, just think, is this a new thing that bourgeois ideologues are doing, or has this been, a sort of general phenomenon to how the bourgeois ideologues react to whenever there is a government, a people, a country that wants to take a route that's outside of their dominated imperialist global capitalist system. So think, are the big scary stories about authoritarianism in the USSR correct? Let's explore, right? But let's not go into it with that bias, which is fed to us by people who, I don't know if they've ever uttered a true word in their goddamn life.
For sure. Sorry, I spaced out a little bit there. I was reading the chat from Jax. How's it going, comrade? So anything else to say about this story? I mean, Ziamora Castro is definitely a step in the right direction for Honduras, but it's been such a right-wing country and such a literally just like a base for the U.S. military to launch regime change efforts in Nicaragua and elsewhere for so long that the path ahead is going to be tough. And, it's not a Marxist-Leninist revolution. She came to power democratically. So she's extremely limited in what she can do, in trying to reform the state apparatus or change the state apparatus and build some sort of socialism. But, still positive things happening. And hopefully the people and the people around her can protect her from any regime change efforts or coups.
Absolutely, brother. All right. Our next segment is about the airline workers. We're going to be reacting to a video. Eddie, do you want me to put that up, or?
Yeah, do you have it? Do you need me to send it to you?
Yes, please do send it to me.
I got you. That's what I'm here for. The producer.
That's all I'm here for. He just sends me stuff for pull up. Nothing else. Okay, here it is. All right, let's get that screen share going. Okay, so this is from More Perfect Union, which I hope you are all following. It covers as closely as I've seen any outlet cover all the stuff that's going on in the U.S. labor movement. And it's definitely a great resource to keep up with. But they say breaking 26,000 flight attendants at American Airlines just voted to authorize a strike. I don't know. It sounds a little familiar, huh? Haven't we seen quite a few other key industries in the U.S. do that in the last year? You know, when you start to see these things, you have to stop thinking about it in in a sort of craft mindset that, oh, this is just a specific issue of this industry, right? When you're speaking with your coworkers or your colleagues about these issues, always try to see those connections and explain those connections on the basis of the system that produces them, right? Because, you know, a fight here, great. But this fight is related to all of these other struggles waged by the working class. And the working class has to wage these struggles in the first place because although it produces everything we have in the world, it does not control it. It is not in power. It is subject to a class that, in a very parasitic fashion, steals all the value that they produce for themselves and for the sake of continuously accumulating more and more and more capital in the hands of a few people. So these workers haven't gotten a raise since 2019, and with 99% voting, yes, they're ready to win big. Pilots at American Airline just won a 46% raise. Now it's flight attendants' turn. So let's give this video a watch. Eddie, do you want to say anything before we watch the video?
Go right ahead.
Hey guys, my name is Derek. I am an American Airlines flight attendant. I am going to kind of do a day in the life, like a real day in the life of what it's like to be a flight attendant. I'm doing a really short trip today. I'm just doing a one-day trip flying up to Boston. I'll be up there for a couple of hours and then I fly right back down to DC. So let's see what happens. To kind of get ready for my day, I think one of the first things I do is I usually make coffee. I think most of us kind of survive on caffeine at this point. I just got off of a 4-day trip yesterday. And the night before last, I think I got maybe a full...
You know, some of the bourgeois reductionist historians argue that the Industrial Revolution happened not because of the developments in the forces of production and in the relations of production, but because workers had coffee and were able, therefore, to work a little longer, which is a factor, but not the factor, which we could attribute to the emergence of the modern era of world history. But onwards.
2 hours of sleep after a 10-hour day at work. I don't know if I'm the only flight attendant that does this, but I do not unpack my suitcase other than like dirty clothes. I work so much that it's easier for me to just kind of keep it all in my suitcase and then, you know, wash some of it when I get home. So I made it to work. Our airline, you have to be signed in at work an hour before your flight. We start boarding the plane about 30 to 35 minutes prior to departure. However, our pay doesn't start until the boarding door is closed on the plane. So even though we're required to be signed in by, you know, an hour before departure, and you can get into trouble if you're not signed in on time, my pay essentially does not start until that door is closed.
How is that legal? How is that illegal? They're basically clocking in and then not getting paid till the boss wants them to start. I mean, for people who commute, you know, I think that's kind of BS if you don't get paid for gas or you don't get paid, you know, for car repairs because you're traveling back and forth for your employer, you know, but to actually make them clock in but to not start paying them until you want to start paying them, like what an absolute scam. You know, what a way to just decrease wages as much as possible to try and increase that absolute surplus value.
There you go. You hit the nail on the head. And there's so many, like, this is one form that takes, but there's so many other forms where we'll clock out, but are we really clocking out? You know, how many different ways does the damage that the workday does on our body and on our spirits, you know, if you believe in such a thing, on our attitudes, on our emotions, how does that drag into the rest of the day such that, yeah, we clock out, but it's still affecting us when we're home and trying to enjoy our time with our family or whatever.
Weather or if there's a maintenance issue, if that door is not closed, essentially we're sitting there not getting paid at all. I think most flight attendants would agree that boarding is one of the busiest and most hectic parts
of our day. It's where everything goes wrong. To not be compensated for that is really rough. You're getting paid half of everything you're doing that day. I mean, imagine coming into work at 7 a.m. and you don't get home until 8 o'clock.
Carlos, can you pause it quick? This is really interesting. The fact that they're kept as private contractors, like much of the trucking industry. We've talked about this a lot. Carlos wrote a really good article about Uber and Lyft in California, where there was actually a law passed making sure that they are private contractors rather than regular employees. This is also what I don't know about the WWE, but definitely what the UFC does with their fighters. They say you're private contractors, right? We're hiring you. You're not our employee. We're working together. This is a mutual business contract. So what that does is it prevents the company from having to give the workers normal benefits that you would have to give your employees. And it also prevents those workers from being able to form a union because they're not standard employees. They're private contractors. It also makes it easier for them to fire you. I mean, it's really easy to do that in a right to work state anyways, but it's like taking away every semblance of collective power that the workers still have in this country and just like smashing it to bits is what the whole private contractor thing does.
Right, and they phrase it in such interesting terms. I mentioned this in the article, but they use terms like flexibility. Now you have flexibility. You're an independent contractor, and it's like in sex. I think it's the quote that I have. Flexibility just means you're getting fucked a lot easier for the person doing the fucking, and that's all really flexibility amounts to. It amounts to the boss not having to give you the things that historically the labor movement have won as concessions from the capitalist class, duties and responsibilities that employers have towards employees that are just completely eroded when workers are considered independent contractors.
So, you were working for 12, 13 hours, but you only took home about 5 of that.
Let's get on the plane. So I will see you guys in Boston. So made it to Boston. Everything was good. The flight was pretty easy. I forgot to meal prep, so I'm here eating an overly priced $18 pizza in the Boston airport.
I'm sitting here for 3 hours. Once again, you're not compensated for that.
We're in contract negotiations right now with the airline. We have been for quite some time. We have not had a new contract since 2019, which means that we have not had any raises since 2019.
We kept this airline running during a pandemic, and all we're asking for is fair wages. All we're asking for is quality of life improvements. This is not money that makes anybody rich at all. This is just money that ensures that your employees of the largest airline in the world, who is boasting and bragging constantly about making record-breaking profits, this is to ensure that they can put food on the table, that they can be comfortable, and that they're not living paycheck to paycheck just to make ends meet. So we are doing what we call a strike authorization vote. It just means that if the strike becomes necessary, that we've approved it. So I think it's important for the flight attendants at American Airlines to stand in solidarity and be unified, because it shows the company that we will do what it takes, up to and including a strike, to be able to secure the contract that we deserve and the contract that we've earned.
Headed back to the plane to go home. And finally back home. That felt like a longer day than it actually was.
All right, guys, so that concludes my day in the life of a flight attendant. I'm going to hit the bed because I'm exhausted. And thanks for watching. Good night.
Yeah, hopefully that fella doesn't lose his job for that. Shout out to him for putting his livelihood at risk to do that video for More Perfect Union and show us what's going on. I mean, that's what they do. Our buddy Louis just got, I mean, it was a while ago now, but he got fired for trying to organize a union. One of our other friends who is keeping it a secret right now, but the same thing just happened to them. You know, they got fired for being active in labor organizing and spreading the word about what's going on. So, you know, there's just very few protections. If you have a union, there's more protections. But if you're in one of those jobs where you're trying to form a union for the first time, it's really tough. And obviously, you know, movements like that require leadership. So what the bosses will do is target the leaders, right? The people who are educated about organizing, are educated about unions, and are are leading their coworkers in the unionization effort, those are the people who are the first to be suppressed. And American Airlines, they have the money to pay their workers. Their fourth quarter profits in 2022 were looks like 127 million, and they had a full year net income of $803 million. Yet their employees are living paycheck to paycheck, and yet they resort to the scummiest tactics, like not paying their workers once they clock in, only paying them once they get to a certain point in the workday, which just shows how they'll literally suck you for everything you're worth or everything that they possibly can, right? Any way to just increase surplus value a little bit and cut down on the cost of production, drive down your wages. The capitalists are going to do it. They want to produce as cheaply as possible and sell as expensively as possible. I don't know if expensively is a word, but
I'll give you the pass, because remember, philosophers, we can make up
that's
words.
right.
So, yeah, and then what ends up happening when your wages are not enough to buy the things you need to survive? What do you end up forced to do? What Marx calls in the third volume of Capital, the second form of exploitation that working people are forced into, which is debt slavery, right? And that's something that it's riddling our current era of capitalism, where the proletariat that has been the most indebted or enslaved in the form of debt of any proletariat in the history of humanity, and that is something that's telling, and it's a condition that not only enslaves us to in the form of wage slavery, that immediate form of primary exploitation, but it lingers throughout our lives, for trying to do very basic things like buy a house or pay for food, pay for rent, get an education, pay for medical bills because you didn't have insurance or because your insurance didn't fully cover you. These are realities that literally almost all Americans, well, all working class Americans specifically, are facing. And this is a reality that's in many ways historically unique to our working class, and it just adds another layer. I don't know if perhaps we can bring the term super exploitation for this, because you have both the systematic appearance of that normal exploitation and the extraction of extra value, not specifically through the workplace, but through the indebtedness that people have to get into in order to survive. So it's almost like a unique form of super exploitation that the vast majority of our working people are in. And that's why it's the only natural thing that we can end up doing, the thing we've had the conditions to do basically forever, but now the best conditions possible, is throw our lot in with working class people from around the world as well that are in similar conditions to the ones that we're in, and with struggles, anti-imperialist struggles, like those being waged by Russia, like those being waged by China, in some ways those being waged by Iran, that are fighting against an order that oppresses those nations and seeks to impose neocolonial imperialist forms of being onto those nations. And what they're fighting against is the same thing we're fighting against. It's the same elite that dominates us here at home, that super exploits and extract resources from our brothers abroad and their land. So, it's in many ways a global struggle that we're in. And I think it's becoming clearer and clearer for working class people to see this, especially when you have things like social media, that when the French protests were going on, they were all over TikTok. Yep. Working class people could see, oh shit, this is what people who do the sort of thing that I do here in France are doing to their elite. I think we could do it to our elite.
Might spark that world revolution that the Trotskyites are waiting for. Social media might be the key. Thank you so much, JFlow Grappling Academy. This is really appreciate the super chats, and as well as our Patreon supporters and YouTube members are how we fund ourselves here at the Institute. We have no outside funding, no big money donors, so it's all from the people, by the people, for the people. So thank you so much, JFlow Grappling Academy. This is wild. We know that the UFC is hyper exploitative. They often pay their fighters less than $40,000 to get in the cage and fight, and then they don't pay for their health care. They don't pay for their coaches' flights. They don't pay for their training expenses. So a lot of that money just disappears like that. Plus, a lot of it's taxed because the government has to take a big portion of it and send that to Ukraine. So these fighters end up making hardly any money, you know, and the most ridiculous thing is that the UFC like doesn't pay their health care when they're literally fighting in a cage. You know, if there's one occupation where people need health care, it's that. But this is wild. It says the UFC recently added a clause to the contract. Since the UFC built the fighters' brand, they will now own a slice of all businesses the fighters do for the rest of their lives. That's insane. We know that Conor McGregor was trying to actually kind of do the reverse. He was trying to get a slice of the UFC. He was like, you have to give me stock options as a part of the payment for my next fight. And they've seen McGregor blow up, and a lot of fighters blow up with, you know, podcasts or side businesses, or they have to do all these things in order to survive because the UFC is raking in money hand over fist, but doesn't pay their fighters enough to live. Tons of them still have second jobs. So it makes sense that now they're trying to suck money out of their fighters' side hustle. You know, we built your brand, so even if you have a successful business, the UFC gets a cut. And we're doing new segments now where we cover issues in sports. And those who follow us on TikTok have probably seen this, but one of the stories I want to cover soon on the stream is Francis Ngannou, because he left the UFC because he was demanding health care and better pay, not just for himself, but all fighters. The UFC obviously refused. Dana White trashed him to the media. He's been trashing him ever since this happened. And Francis went and signed with another organization called the Professional Fighters League, where he got all these massive gains for the fighters. And they're trying to make that now the league that's, you know, more fighter friendly, which we'll see. They still have the same market motivations, you know, as the UFC. Every promotion or MMA organization that exists under capitalism is going to try and maximize their own profit and maximize their own surplus value. But Francis Ngannou is a hero for that. And I mean, this is a guy who started in the sand mines of Africa. You know, that's how he got his start, and worked his way up and became the UFC heavyweight champion. And it's just disgusting, but also hilarious to watch Dana White, the UFC spokesman, bash Francis Ngannou, because he just makes the grossest lies and smears about this guy. But every step of the way, Francis keeps winning. You know, he keeps beating the UFC and exposing the UFC and these rich ghouls like Dana White, who have never stepped in the cage in their lives, have probably never been in a fight in their lives, but are raking in money hand over fist off the labor of these fighters who are risking their lives for our entertainment. So, yeah, a lot to be analyzed there. This is a perfect example of a capitalist institution, the UFC, and how it works. You know, you go against the business in any way, and this bald guy, Dana White, is going to be blasting you, calling you a piece of shit on every news outlet that'll listen to him. That's how they work. You go against their interests, and you're dead to them.
That's absolutely true. And we have someone here from the audience, Comrade Stephen Palazzolo. He says, I've been fired for trying to join a union. Yeah, if there's any way that you try to fight back, they're going to retaliate. You know, there's a interesting point made by Vivek Shibber, who we've interviewed on the Institute show before. He says that whereas the tradition of Western Marxism has argued that we haven't had a revolution in the West primarily because of ideological reasons, he says the primary reasons are not ideological, though we do have those, but the primary reasons are resignation. For many working class people, does not seem worth the fight and the result that could happen, like what happened here to Stephen, which is getting fired. In some cases now, I've heard that one of the tactics to fight back against unionism within Starbucks has been to just shut down the store and relocate and hire a whole new set of people. So that's a challenge, right? That's not just ideology. That's a material reality that tries to enforce resignation upon a working class that is fighting back.
Yeah. for sure. One of the fighters. Oh, sorry. One of the fighters also tried taking Dana White and the UFC to court. But when you're going against a corporation like that, they're just going to hire the best lawyers that money can buy. Now that guy owes like thousands of dollars in legal fees to the UFC. It's a really sad story, and he's a legend of the sport. Mark Hunt is his name. Support him if you want to, because he's another guy who took on the UFC and exposed their corruption and just got destroyed for it. I mean, his financial situation is probably ruined for life. And in the past, when fighters have taken legal action against the UFC, Dana White has milked them for everything they're worth. He's made them pay the UFC back those legal fees because he's a vindictive psychopath. He's a perfect example of a personification of capital. He represents what is best for the UFC surplus value. If you go against what's best for the UFC surplus value, you're a piece of shit. You're a liar. You're a scumbag to him. You know, if you do what's best for the UFC, you're great. You're a superstar. You know, you're everything under the sun. Eddie versus Dana White. If Eddie wins, the UFC unionizes. Of all the people on this earth that I would love to be locked in a cage with and just go all out, Dana White is up there. Top 10 for sure. I mean, to watch this bald loser who's never stepped in the cage bash your favorite fighters, right? Especially when you're a Marxist and you have this perspective and you know that the UFC is exploiting the fighters for everything they're worth and, you know, making huge profits while the fighters can't even pay for healthcare. And then you watch him go to the media and bash your favorite fighters. It's so infuriating. And now Dana White's power slap league, where you literally just stand there and slap each other in the face. Former UFC fighters were saying that they were being offered $2,000 to do slap fighting. This multimillionaire Dana White and this WME IMG corporation that owns the UFC, made up of multiple billionaire shareholders, they are offering fighters $2,000 to get knocked out cold. And like, who are the kind of people who are signing up to do that? It's not athletes. It's not professionals. It's not even people who's, you know, who are probably doing anything. It's people who desperately need money, who are signing up to get concussions, get CTE for $2,000. So yes, bring it on, Dana White. You're a loser. You are not worth anything in my eyes. You know, all your wealth was created by the fighters who you exploit. Bring it on. I will take you down and pound your bald head in. Dana White's worth $500 million. Jeez. Sorry, what were you saying? I'll beat him with a large spoon for symbolic purposes.
Yeah, Steven says 5 of us were let go. Yeah. Yeah, that slapbox thing. I rarely do this, but when something comes up, whenever it comes up, I just don't even try to stay there a second. I don't want to give it any clicks. I don't want to endorse it in any form possible. And I know that's not a solution, but it's so incredibly stupid. And you look at the comments, and people are agreeing. This is fucking stupid. Like, this
all
is
the comments.
ridiculous. That's all the comments. But they're commenting, they're watching, and that's bringing clicks. You know, the algorithm doesn't see those comments. It doesn't see that, oh, people are interacting with it because they fucking hate it and we should not share it around. It just sees interactions and it boosts. So Dana White doesn't give a shit if the people in the comments, everyone is hating on it. Insofar as they continue hating, it's going to continue getting clicks and interactions. So.
Absolutely. I've actually seen some people like Luke Rockhold who have gotten really based. He's a former UFC fighter. Definitely not someone I would consider an intellectual. But he was saying, like, this is a sign of a decaying culture. And he was like saying at this press conference, like, do you guys want a culture like this? Do you want a culture where people slap each other and knock each other out for $2,000 and we all gawk and we're like, oh, wow. Like, that's stupid. And it's the kind of culture and the kind of entertainment that's propped up by capitalism. right? They can make money by paying desperate people who are created by the system $2,000 to slap each other and knock each other out. So they're going to do it. And, you know, people, like Carlos said, everyone hates it, but they'll film it for the shock value just because they can get clicks. And Dana White's happy to profit off that.
This is a really good comment from comrade Jay. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. One, don't say union around work until you have every other worker's contact info, one-on-one to cut issue. Until you're sure that the people you're engaging with are legit. Determine the scale of solidarity with the cause of labor organizing. Bosses will remove the contact. So that's another thing. Unless you're like absolutely certain that the effort is going to win, that's another incentive that's produced behind resignation, because as soon as they find you trying to do anything, you're out. And they have campaigns, like we've covered it before, the Amazon promo videos, basically showing people how to be a good snitch, and how to bring it up to their managers that someone came up to them talking about unionizing or asking about what their pay was, or showing any form of solidarity in a form that's destined to like fighting back against the company. So they're not dumb, and they do as many things as possible to prevent us from doing that. Remember that like one of the central things that capitalist industrialization brings about is a division of labor within manufacturing itself. That's huge. That just develops this emergent property where production just completely explodes. Today, there's specifically in the U.S. at least, and I'm guessing it's something more general in the West, there's a few forms that the capitalists have used to fight back against that socialization in the workplace. In the places where it continues, you have something like what you have in Amazon, which is that workers are shifted around so that they're not in proximity with the same worker for a long periods of time, and therefore removes the potential for that connection that can allow for a working class united struggle. They continue to be strangers to each other. Another form is what we talked about earlier with the American airline workers, which is considering them independent contractors. That's a form of dividing workers from each other, gigifying the economy. So these are new things that we have to take into account, which means that the way that capitalism is operating, although in substance it still looks like 1867 when Marx published Capital for the first time, it's taken new forms to adjust to the era and to specifically the technological revolution that we've seen in the last 2-3 decades.
Yeah, I always like to say class struggle is two-sided. Like we say class struggle in terms of the working class rising up, but the ruling class knows that there's a class struggle, and they've really become experts in suppressing the working class, preventing union organization, especially here in the neoliberal United States. But I was reading Ernest Mandel's Intro to Capital Volume 3 earlier, and he was saying the advantage that we have, though, like they're more class conscious than the workers in a lot of ways, the ruling class, but they're also thrown into a constant competition with each other because of the market. So they're limited in how far their solidarity can go. Whereas the competition that workers are in is really an illusion. It's really in our benefit to have solidarity with each other and cooperate. So there's no limit to how far class consciousness of the workers can go. So you'll see you'll see the capitalists work together to like smash uprisings and stuff, but then they'll go right back to competing and trying to knock each other out of the market. So, before we go here, I want to jump into our sports segment. This is something new that we want to do pretty much every stream. Obviously, a lot of Americans watch professional sports, and as we were talking about earlier with the UFC, there's a lot of class struggle going on in sports. There's the sports that we have today, especially professional sports, are in a capitalist form. So there's a lot to be critiqued there. And one of the things that's going on right now is NFL running backs are demanding a change to the pay structure because they feel that they're being criminally underpaid based on their output and based on their value to the teams, based on their use value, one might say. So even, football analysts who believe in capitalism and the market system are saying that, yeah, running backs are being paid less than they should be. They're more valuable than what they're paying. And I've seen some sports journalists suggest intervening in the market to artificially, boost the pay of running backs. So what's happened is it used to be in the NFL, there was one, what you call bell cow back, meaning the back who gets most of your team's carries, and they basically put the team on their back. But nowadays it's more common to have running backs who split time. So you no longer have this one running back who becomes, a superstar for your team. You have a couple running backs who you oftentimes pay a lot less. And one of the reasons they switched to this system of multiple running backs per team is because it is the most punishing position that you can play in the sport of football. I mean, think about it. The running back is the one who's supposed to get short yardage. They're literally handing you the ball so you can run through the team's linemen and smack dab into their linebackers. It's an extremely punishing position on the brain and the body. So a lot of times running backs' primes aren't that long. So in 2011, the NFL put a limit on how much rookies can make with their first contract. So when the NFL draft happens, all these new rookies come into the league. And what used to happen was they would give the biggest prospects these giant contracts. And then if it turned out that that rookie was kind of a bust, if he didn't pan out and end up being as good in the NFL as they thought he was going to be, the team would be on the hook for all that money. So they decreased the amount that the teams have to pay these rookies or are allowed to pay these rookies, which sounds like it would make sense. But all that did in terms of the labor market was drive down the wages or the salaries or the prices of all positions, because every single year at every position, especially running back, a new crop of rookies are injected into the league. And teams can get star players right out of college, but really cheap because you're limited by the rules and how much you can pay them. And one of the main positions where rookies can step in right away and make an impact in the NFL is running back. So teams are realizing, why would we hang on to our veteran running back who's really expensive if we could just let him go and then pay a rookie who, is probably going to be close to as good, far less money. So it's ended up driving down the salaries that all of the running backs are making. And now collectively they're demanding a change, especially some of the star running backs like Jonathan Taylor, Josh Jacobs, Derrick Henry. These are players who are, with Josh Jacobs and Derrick Henry, they're the best players on their team, right? They're stars. It's hard to calculate this, but for sure, a lot of the fans who are piling into the stadium to watch these teams every week are coming because of those running backs. Yet because of the way that the rules are set up and because it's an unregulated market system for the most part, they're able to drive down the pay of those running backs, even if they're star players. So now all the running backs, I mean, they're limited in what they can do. There is a players association that will fight for the players, and there is precedence for going on strike. That's probably not what's going to happen here, but all the running backs are collectively coming together and voicing their support, which is interesting because football is such a competitive sport, but you have running backs from every team coming out and arguing against the league and arguing against their multi-billionaire owners to try and collectively argue for better pay. And Jonathan Taylor and some other running backs were holding out on their contracts, saying we're not going to sign until you boost our pay, which of course, when they did that collectively, it had a lot of power. When you do it on your own, when you threaten to withhold your labor alone, there's only so much you can do. Because like I said, your team will just go draft a new rookie running back for cheap. But when all these running backs are collectively demanding change, then they can actually force something to happen, which is, again, when we look at class struggle within professional sports, it gives us a good example of how things work on a broader level. In any industry, one worker can't do it, but you collectively get together and collectively demand a raise in wages or collectively threaten to withhold your labor or go on strike. That's when you can start making some changes. So solidarity with these running backs. I hope they keep going. I hope they get their pay increased. It is an absolutely punishing sport, and this is the most punishing position out of any of them. So great to see this. And I mean, it's just part of the overall wave of class consciousness and labor organizing that we're seeing across the U.S. It's literally in every industry. It's the service industries. It's the transport industries like UPS and Amazon. It's the productive industries. It's the industries like rail. It's everywhere. Labor is waking up to the fact that they're being exploited and demanding a change. So you got to harness this moment, harness this increase in class consciousness, and push it forward towards a socialist consciousness so much as we can.
Beautifully said, brother. Beautifully said.
Goal, by the way.
Oh, man. Well, we actually got through all of the topics we were planning on getting through today. If you haven't had a chance to do so already, please do make sure to check out our recent publication from the Midwestern Marx Publishing Press. It's called The Outcome of Classical German Philosophy, Friedrich Engels and G.W.F. Hegel and Ludwig Feuerbach. It's from Thomas Riggins, Dr. Thomas Riggins, who's someone who has been teaching for basically 60 years in philosophy and humanities departments across the nation, some as prestigious as NYU. NYU, for those that don't know, is ranked number 1 in philosophy departments in the world. And you have hearing Marxist-Leninists that taught at NYU. The same thing for New School for Social Research. He taught there as well as one of the most prestigious departments in philosophy. Then you have, of course, City University, New York, which he also taught in, amongst many other schools as well. And what he's doing in this book is basically showing you through Engels' famous text, Ludwig Feuerbach and the Outcome of Classical German Philosophy, the philosophical foundations behind Marxism, both in the philosophy of G.W.F. Hegel and in the philosophy of the not so good but still good Ludwig Feuerbach, and how Marxism basically sublates. It overcomes both of these, taking rational kernels here and there and leaving the mystical shells behind. So please do make sure to check that out. It's got the Institute prices. It's very cheap, $12 for a paperback copy and $5 for an ebook copy. A book of this intellectual quality published by any university press or any major editorial will easily cost $40 to $60 paperback and $30 ebook. So if you want to support the Institute and if you want to learn the basics of Marxism, please do make sure to check out Dr. Riggins' book. Again, $12 paperback, $5 ebook. You can find it at midwesternmarx.com or midwesternmarx.com/book. So please go check that out and buy a copy if you would like to support the Institute.
Absolutely. Or any of our other books. They're all up there. And some of the older ones are like super cheap now if you get them on ebook. So you get like $4 books there. It'll keep you busy with your reading for a while. But got another super chat here as we're wrapping up from Mauricio. Thank you. This is a tough question for me. I had this conversation with my cousin the other day when I was visiting him in Minneapolis, and we were walking around the Viking Stadium. Eddie, do you think that the Packers are a fan-owned team because Wisconsin was such an ardent socialist state in the early 20th century class struggle? Oh, good question. I just read the Packers socialist part. I'm a Viking fan, so the Packers are objectively, though, the most socialistic team in the NFL. They're owned by their fans. Whereas every other team has some multi-billionaire owner. And the Vikings their stadium is US Bank Stadium, not very socialist at all. Their origin story is some weird thing about how like a Nordic rune washed up on shore. So like the people there believe that they were actual Vikings. It sounds like some weird like fascist mythology, to be honest with you. So like the Vikings are not the most socialist team and the Packers are, yet I'm a Viking fan, but I've been one my whole life. I can't change now, unfortunately, but at least I do appreciate that the Packers are fan owned, but I have no idea if that's why. That would be a great research topic to look into for one of these sports segments that we're doing. Actually, I'm going to write that down.
especially for the Journal of American Socialist Studies, which is
Oh,
doing its call for submissions, its call for papers, and is doing this call up until the 1st of December. So if you're interested in this topic and would like to take it up in the form of a research paper, consider submitting it to the Institute's scholarly journal, the Journal of American Socialist Studies.
please do. I would love to read about that. I would love to read about Wisconsin's socialist history in general. You know, obviously it's a great source of pride as a Wisconsinite myself, but I've lived in Iowa for like 8 years now, but
Yeah, it's I've read some on it, and it's the tradition of socialism that we don't identify with, but there's still rational kernels there that we can pull out. Um, they called them sewer socialists because they were so focused on just meeting the everyday needs of people. Um, there's a way in which they might have lost sight at times of the bigger picture and bigger struggle, but they still set up a good precedent for later socialists who would come around and perhaps would have that trust in by the people because of the sewer socialists then. But yeah, Molly McGraw says Midwestern Marx is the People's Stream. Yes, absolutely. The People's Institute, the People's Stream, the People's Publishing Press, the People's Journal, bridging the gap of scholarly work and popular people-friendly readings. So, yeah. Well, do you have anything else to add before we go, Comrade Eddie? Oh, thank you, Jaime.
yeah, I'm really pumped to read people's submissions for the journal, and I'm excited for these sports segments going forward. And yeah, thanks for hanging out, and thanks to all our moderators. Got one more super chat here. I just joined a bike co-op workshop. Communist AF sounds like a cool place to work. Religion and peace. Thank you so much for being a YouTube member and for the $2 super chat. Really appreciate it.
Make sure to check out Jay's biography. Remember what it's called, Eddie?
The John Lee Anderson one?
No. The it's not his biography, but it's notes.
Motorcycle Diaries.
Motorcycle Diaries.
Diarios Motocicletas.
Yeah. There's a movie that's actually fairly accurate and pretty entertaining that I would definitely recommend now that you're working at a bike co-op workshop. You should get your coworkers to watch the movie or maybe do an event around the movie because it's although it's in Spanish, they do have the subtitles in English in Amazon. So.
My dad shows that movie for his Spanish classes, actually.
Oh, that's badass.
It is.
Nice. But yeah, it's a sick story, and in some ways, very in line with certain Emersonian and U.S. American notions of like traveling the world sort of thing. You get it in what's that Christmas movie that I know at least that I love, but it's the old classic.
Life.
It's a Wonderful Life, right? What's the main character? What he wants to do is travel the world, right? Become an engineer and travel the world. It's in many ways a central part of the American assumption, what Du Bois called the American assumption, and Jay was kind of living that out in South America.
For sure, it's one of the greatest movies of all time, too. Well,
Absolutely.
Thank you all for watching. Thank you to all the super chatters and our moderators. You got anything else, Carlos, before we head out?
No, that'll be all. Thank you, and we'll see you all next time.
Solidarity, everyone.
of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic